I am pro-Israel and proud of it, and I am pro-Palestine and proud of it. I favor a two-state solution. I want to see Israel live in peace and prosperity. I want to see the Palestinian people live in peace and prosperity. I see no conflict between being pro-Israel and pro-Palestine. Now, I am pro-Israel, not only because I'm a Jew. I am pro-Israel because I am a civil libertarian, because I have devoted my life to fighting for human rights, because I'm a feminist, because I'm an environmentalist, because I'm a gay rights supporter, because I'm a lover of peace. For all of those reasons, I support Israel. When Jimmy Carter wrote his book, he said he wanted to write his book to stimulate a debate. So the first thing Brandeis University did was invite him to debate me. And Jimmy Carter said, no, I don't want to debate. I want to be up on the stage alone. And they said, well, how about if Dershowitz follows you?
It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you this afternoon. The driving force for the resulting persecution and oppression of the Palestinians comes from a minority of Israelis and their desire for Palestinian land. When I proposed this title, by the way, the title doesn't have any punctuation in it. We intended to be Palestinian peace, not apartheid, but erroneously people have put a colon there. My bottom line was there has been no peace efforts at that time for 5 years. And the Palestinians are horribly treated. And their treatment is not known at all, or minimally, in this country. I don't have Air Force One anymore, so I have to run. But I just said that if you all have questions that I haven't been able to answer, I'll let the moderator here pick out 10 or 12 of them, and if you'll send the questions on email, I'll send you the answers back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you again.
President Carter has essentially congratulated the Palestinian leadership for rejecting Camp David and Taba. In his book, he said there was no possibility that any Palestinian leader could accept such terms and survive. I'm only glad he didn't make that statement to Anwar Sadat. It takes courage to make peace. Survival is not the only goal of a great leader. Making peace is the goal. And if the Palestinians had accepted Camp David and Taba, or even if they had rejected Camp David and Taba and come in with a counter offer, today we would not have had the second Intifada. There would not be a security barrier. There would not be anything that President Carter could correctly or incorrectly, and I believe incorrectly, call apartheid. We did not hear today anything about the fact that the Palestinians could have had a state in 1938. The Israelis would have had a sliver along the coast, and the Palestinians could have had 80% of what is now Israel. They said no, because the Palestinians wanted there to be no Jewish state more than they wanted their own state. They could have had a state. They had a state in 1948, when Israel got 55%, but 40% of the arable land in that area, and the Palestinians got a majority of the arable land and about a little less than half of the total land.
New York, Friday, May 14, 1948. The United Nations General Assembly is in special session. Opposing the United Nations' decision to partition Palestine are the Arab states led by Syria's Faris el-Khoury.
This plan is complicated. It is very hard to implement. It does not conserve peace. It would lead to bloodshed. There are many difficulties.
The Jewish representatives on the other side are waiting for their hour of destiny. The minutes of Britain's mandate are ticking to an end.
The Palestinians, with all the other Arab states, invaded Israel and said, "We don't want a state. We're happy to be occupied by Jordan and Egypt. We just don't want there to be a Jewish state.
Will those in favor of this draft resolution please signify by raising their hands?
They could have had a state in 1967 when Israel, you won't find this in President Carter's book, accepted resolution of the United Nations 242. It's not there, but it happened. Israel accepted 242. All the Arab states and the Palestinians got together at Khartoum and issued their three famous no's: no recognition, no peace, no negotiation. They could have had a state in 2000 and 2001. They said no. They said no to an incredibly generous offer. And the state would not have been a state separated by spider-like roads. It would have been a totally contiguous state. And you can see it in the maps that are in Dennis Ross's book, the maps that were shown to the Israelis, the maps that were constructed from the actual offers made at Camp David. If you don't believe me, and if you don't believe Dennis Ross, and you don't believe President Clinton, then listen to Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia, who was the Saudi representative to the Camp David Accords. He said that Clinton and Dennis Ross are telling the truth. He said this very reluctantly about the offer, and that Arafat is telling a lie, and that Arafat's refusal to accept the offer at Camp David was a crime against the Palestinian people and all the people in the area. But you won't read that in President Carter's book. Jimmy Carter's a very smart man. I've known him since 1976. I thought he was a man of good faith and goodwill. How can you explain always misrepresenting facts on the side of the Palestinians and against Israel?
I can't fully comprehend what his motivations might be. I can say it's clear that he has not made a serious effort to understand what took place. And he's simply embraced revisionism without looking at what the actual record was.
A very close friend of President Carter, Professor Kenneth Stein, who was the founding head of the Carter Center at Emory University, resigned his position after this book, and he gave us one of his major reasons is he sat with Carter at many of the meetings that President Carter had after he left the White House with Middle East leaders. And he's the one who took notes of those meetings. And then he looks at what Carter says in the book about what happened in those meetings, and he says, these things didn't happen. This is not what was said. This is not what my notes say.
Yes, there is apartheid in the Middle East. It exists in Saudi Arabia, where there's gender apartheid, religious apartheid, all kinds of apartheid. But Israel, a country in which equality is extended to Arabs, to Christians, to Muslims, to blacks, to whites, where Arabs serve in the Knesset, where they serve on the Supreme Court, where they serve with equal status at universities, where affirmative action is part of Israel's policy. To call Israel apartheid?
In Israel proper, the law is equal to all citizens, all residents, regardless of race, color, creed, religion, and gender. This is ensured both in the Declaration of Independence and in the constitutional laws which govern all legislation.
Whatever Israel does as a Jewish state, it's problematic for Jimmy Carter. Indeed, his obsession with Israel. Here's a man who toasted the Shah of Iran, who had close relations with the Saudis, who was very good friends with Yasser Arafat, has a problem with democratically elected Israeli Jewish leaders.
So in my talk at Brandeis University, I said, email him the following question. Did you advise Yasser Arafat on Camp David and Taba, and if so, what was your advice? It's the only question Jimmy Carter has refused to answer. And he's refused to answer it from day one till today. I think the circumstantial case is overwhelming that Jimmy Carter has blood on his hands. The blood of 4,000 Palestinians, the blood of over 1,000 Israelis, and was a co-conspirator in a crime against the Palestinian people. Oh, but you hear from students, Jews were colonialists, like the British in India or the French in Algeria. Well, who were the Jews colonialists for? They came from Poland, they came from Russia, they came from Lithuania. Were they carrying the Polish flag? They left that far behind. They were immigrants. They came to Palestine for the same reason our grandparents and great-grandparents came to America, to live freely, to live a Jewish life, to partake in democracy, to escape from pogroms, to develop Jewish literature and Jewish music, and a Jewish symphony and a Jewish university, all of which happened in Palestine well before any statehood was declared. That's self-determination. There is a Palestinian narrative, and Israelis must know the Palestinian narrative. There's an Israeli narrative, and the narratives don't often join together, but there is also a truthful narrative.
Israel is seen as this strange interloper, these Jewish crusaders who came and threw out the Arabs from their ancestral homes. There has been here a reversal of the perception of history and the facts of history. And I maintain that the only way you can really make the case for Israel is to go back to the historical facts.
Jews probably lived in Palestine, or the land of Israel, consistently since the end of the second millennium BC, from the 1200 BC, continuously until the present day.
Dealing with the archaeology of Jerusalem is an additional chapter to the very basic element that the Jewish people are staying and living in their homeland, meaning Israel.
We are now above the city of David, which is a narrow spur, a hot dog-shaped hill, which has within it the remains of the earliest occupation in Jerusalem, starting about 6,000 years ago. This is the place where the stage is for most of the events mentioned in the Bible.
We are facing the historical basin of the old city, which is really the core of the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the old city and the area around it. About 95%, I would say, of the sacred places are within this area for Christianity, Islam, and the Jewish people.
This is the area in which the civilization of the ancient Israelites, which is the foundation of Jewish history, was forged.
Last season, we found a small seal impression in a 1 centimeter diameter, something, it's made of clay, and it was fired hard because of the fire of the destruction. And on it, actually you could read, Yehochal ben Shelemyahu ben Shuvi. This name appears in the Bible. It's a person, and he was a minister, an official, high official, at the time of Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah. I mean, this is a direct, hello from the past.
Jerusalem is mentioned in the Bible alone by name 667 times, but the name Jerusalem is not even mentioned once in the Quran. We honor the historic heritage of Jerusalem. This is unfortunately not done by the Islamic Waqf upon the Temple Mount, who destroys even Islamic remains. I'm now in charge of sifting through material which was brutally removed by the Islamic Waqf from inside the Temple Mount in 1999 by a barbaric excavation which was carried out by heavy machinery.
What is happening in a very systematic way is that the Muslims on the Temple Mount are destroying that heritage to try to blot out the fact that Islam exists at the same time as other heritages, as other traditions exist. We are not acknowledging that when they have digs under the Temple Mount, that are destroying the artifacts of the Second Temple, what they are trying to do is destroy human heritage.
In my judgment, if Israel were to turn over the old city of Jerusalem to the Palestinian Authority, the outcome would be disastrous for the holy sites, because we have seen across the Middle East, from the Bamiyan Valley in Afghanistan to the Shiite mosques in Iraq to Joseph's tomb in Nablus, that radical Islam shows no tolerance for the holy sites of other faiths. Therefore, under Palestinian rule, Jerusalem would be put in very great danger.
The Jews established themselves in Palestine by dint of purchase of lands and establishment of settlements. They bought lands mostly from absentee Arab landlords who lived in Beirut or Damascus, but owned land in Palestine. They bought lands from them and established their settlements. Sometimes they had to evict Arab tenant farmers who didn't own the land but worked the land which had belonged to these absentee landowners. The Jews wanted to work the land themselves. They didn't want to share land with tenant farmers who didn't own the land. They didn't take land from anybody, and when they evicted tenant farmers, they did so within the bounds of the law.
In World War I, the Jews of Israel were on the right side and supported the British and the Americans against the Germans. They were, in part, rewarded.
The English had a very positive view of Zionism. Some British leaders, such as Lord Alfred Balfour, who was the Foreign Secretary, were what you call restorationists. They were avid Christians who believed that by restoring the Jews to their ancient homeland, that would precipitate the second coming of Christ.
British policy in London and as exercised in Palestine was essentially a pro-Zionist policy in line with the ideology, if you like, of the Balfour Declaration, support the establishment of a Jewish state.
The British in the 1920s, as they began to realize that their promises under the Balfour Declaration could not be easily implemented, tried to palliate the Palestinian Arabs by appointing a leader. Palestinian Arabs didn't have a leadership. They created a new office. They called it the Grand Mufti. The Grand Mufti is simply an interpreter of Islamic law. It's not a position that holds any political power, but the British named Haj Amin al-Husseini to this position in the hope that he would constructively interact with the British and perhaps reach an accommodation with the Jews, and just the opposite happened. Haj Amin al-Husseini became the most rabidly anti-British, anti-Zionist, and indeed anti-Semitic leader perhaps the Palestinians have ever known. British finally are fed up with the Grand Mufti. They exile him to the Seychelles Islands. He manages to escape, and he ends up in Nazi Germany, becomes an avid Nazi enthusiast. He actually visits concentration camps. He approves of the final solution. And Haj Amin al-Husseini's support for Nazism certainly does not redound to the Palestinian Arab benefit after the war. In contrast to the Jews of Palestine, who served with the British Army and fought valiantly, here are the Palestinian Arabs supporting the Nazis. And this fact was not forgotten by the world community after World War II, and becomes a very important part of the debate surrounding the partition of Palestine.
Once the revelations emerged of what had happened in Europe, the camps were opened, the Allied troops went there, pictures were taken, pictures were broadcast around the world. The Western public opinion turned pro-Jewish, so there was massive public support in the West, especially in America, but also in England and France and other countries, for the establishment of a Jewish state. The Jews understood that they must have a state if they want to survive, and this must be the state which was going to be established. All of this translated into the UN vote at the end of 1947 in favor of the establishment of Israel, and into America's recognition of Israel immediately after its establishment on the 15th of May.
A new nation is being born. In the first Jewish city, Tel Aviv, their first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, proclaims the independent Jewish state. British rule is at an end.
Israel's War of Independence, what the Palestinian Arabs call the Nakba, their disaster, really begins on the 30th of November 1947, the day after the UN decides to partition Palestine into an independent Arab and independent Jewish state. The Jews accept the partition resolution, the Arabs reject the partition resolution, and they declare war They go to war against the Jewish community of Palestine. They try to isolate and destroy settlements. They cut off the roads. The Jews are almost defeated. They come close to disaster. In the spring of 1948 now, the Zionist leadership under David Ben-Gurion resolves no longer to exercise restraint, but to strike back.
So they conquered swathes of Arab territory in the Jerusalem corridor, in Western Galilee, in Eastern Galilee, drove out the Arabs from these areas. Many fled as a result of fear, as a result of intimidation, as a result of shelling. Some were actually expelled by Jewish troops, but essentially it was a military move, not a political move, by the Zionist forces, who were faced with either disaster, which they thought would end in a second Holocaust. So there was a partition of the country at the end of the war. The Arab states essentially signed under duress the armistice agreements, but said, well, perhaps the future will tell whether these borders will remain permanent, and in their hearts essentially wanted to get rid of Israel and to destroy Israel. They wanted a second round and a third round and so on. They didn't accept Israel's existence.
Israel didn't try to expel a single Arab until the Arab Revolt, until the Arab states, all of them, refused to accept Israel as a Jewish state in 1948, pursuant to the vote of the United Nations. The Arab refugee problem was caused by the fact that the Palestinians in all of the Arab states attacked Israel. Now, Israel did expel some. I certainly agree with Benny Morris's historical analysis of what went on. But of course, so did many Arab states, make it impossible for Jews to live in Yemen and Iraq and in Syria and in Egypt. And there was essentially an exchange of population where the approximately 850,000 Jews from Arab countries who were essentially forced to leave became refugees, and similarly, approximately 700,000 or so Palestinians became refugees.
And this refugee problem, because it was never solved by the Arabs, or the refugees also were not allowed back by the Jews, remains a consistent and constant problem for the Middle East, for the Palestinians who are in some way identified with this refugee problem, and for the Arab world in general, which regards the existence of the refugees as sort of a standing offense to their honor.
What the Arabs have done here very cleverly is turn the result of their aggression into its cause. When you ask them, why are you attacking Israel? Their answer was because of the refugees. But the Arab refugees were a result of the Arab aggression against the tiny Jewish state. The Arabs say it's the territories that are the reason for the conflict. But you forget that before the Six-Day War of 1967, before the Arabs ganged up to attack Israel, we weren't in those territories. We came into these territories as a result of a war forced on us from them by the Arabs.
With the Palestinians, the Israeli government in the summer of 1967 explored the possibility of creating an autonomous Palestinian entity in the West Bank, and an entity that could transform into an independent state. But the Palestinian leadership on the West Bank turned the Israelis down as well, saying that if they made any agreement with the Zionists, the radicals would kill them. And the radical they mentioned by name was Yasser Arafat.
From this, through this barrel, we can get all what we want.
And so today the Palestinian position, even again of the most moderate Palestinians, still demands the return of millions of refugees and their descendants into pre-1967 Israel, as the borders that existed as of June 4th, 1967. Now, if that is carried out, then Israel will have an Arab majority, will cease being the Jewish state. So it's an existential issue for Israel, and therefore every Israeli government and every American government has rejected that demand from the Palestinians.
How can you have a Jewish democracy? Isn't that a contradiction in terms? And of course, that suggests that Judaism has a singular meaning, that Israel as a Jewish state is Israel as a halachic state, or Israel as a state only for Jews. That's not what Israel as a Jewish state means. What Israel as a Jewish state means, a state in which Jewish values can be expressed, in which the flag is a Jewish flag based on the talit, in which the national anthem proudly talks about Nefesh Yehudi, the heartbeat of a Jew, just like France is a French state and Canada is a Canadian state. Israel is not a Jewish state in the way that every Arab country is a Muslim state.
If you define a Jewish state as a state based on religious, halachic, Jewish traditional law, there is a problem. But if you define a Jewish state the way Theodor Herzl and Chaim Weizmann, David Ben-Gurion, and your obedient servant define it, then there's no problem. Then you speak about the nationality, you speak about the nation state, the nation being the Jews, the Jewish people who have a right to self-determination within the Jewish state.
In a sea of totalitarianism and dictatorship and extremism, we are an island of sanity and the outpost of democracy.
I think that if you were to privately talk to a lot of the Arab Israelis, they will tell you that in no uncertain terms they refuse to budge from Israel if there is some sort of territorial swap, if Jerusalem, the eastern part of Jerusalem is being offered to the Palestinian Authority. Arab Israelis in Jerusalem are saying, no way, we're not moving. And the reason they're saying they're not moving is that with all the problems of being an Arab in a Jewish Israeli reality, they understand what it is to live in a free country. They understand what it is to be able to gather and worship freely and speak freely, and in fact have representatives in the Knesset.
We are misjudged. Again, not to say that we don't make our mistakes, but at least we have tools in Israel to deal with our mistakes. At least we have a Supreme Court, which is an open court, which does not close its doors because of standing, because of justiciability, because of the political question, because of extraterritoriality, because whatever you want. You have an open court, and you have a legislature and an executive branch who fulfill what we say.
Israel has desperately sought to balance human rights. The hero of this is Aharon Barak, the president of the Supreme Court of Israel, whose cases could become a course on how to balance human rights against terrorism. A man who has stood up to the Israeli government, told them they couldn't torture, told them they couldn't send people in to protect their soldiers if it puts people at risk, telling them they couldn't shoot at ambulances even though ambulances carry terrorists. This is a country far better than our own, who has a Supreme Court far better than our own. I would trade our Supreme Court for theirs in a minute, and I'd throw in 3 outfielders to be picked later. That has tried desperately to strike the appropriate balance. Has it always succeeded? No. Has it been imperfect? Yes. And I criticize its imperfections. And I urge all of you to criticize Israel whenever it warrants criticism. But I urge you all to look at the big picture. Look at the countries in the world in which real abuses of human rights occur, in which nobody is trying to strike any balance, in which you can't complain or protest the injustices. They need your help. Countries without a free press need your help. Israel has a completely open free press. Start protesting those countries. If you don't, you're a hypocrite.
Israel, after all, is really fighting for the superiority of the moral code. We couldn't do it all the time because there was a Shoah, which was totally immoral, and we paid a price. We were attacked. We have had to defend ourselves, but that wasn't our choice. The minute that we have a choice to make peace, we did it. The minute we can help other countries, we do it. That's our preference.
When I'm in America, I'm asked, tell me please, Your Honor, can in Israel a Palestinian go to the Supreme Court? And I'm shocked, because this guy may even be a human rights activist. Of course he can. We had 300 cases every year coming from the occupied territories.
I don't know any other democracy in the world where you can petition for redress of grievance as where citizens of Israel or Palestinians in the territories can directly petition the Supreme Court of Israel for redress of grievance and go right to the Supreme Court.
In Israel, everybody has standing. Everybody can challenge. Gets challenged. Everything is justiciable. Everything is subject to the courts. When the Israelis closed off access to Gaza, Supreme Court petition. When the Israelis used military means that were questionable to some, a petition to the Supreme Court. And the Palestinians win many of their cases. And that's kind of democracy in action. You don't judge a democracy by its perfection. You judge it by how it deals with its imperfections and how it responds to imperfections and what remedies it makes available, not only for the majority of its citizens, but for the minority of the citizens.
I don't think in the history of democracy there's ever been a parliament in which a minority representative spoke so determinedly against the host state, against the host society in which they live. I listened to some bigoted speeches against Israel, the like of which you won't hear in any parliament. For instance, one Knesset member said, we got rid of the Turks, we got rid of the British, we'll get rid of you, Israelis.
Unfortunately, for Israel to be able to get its story across, it's not sufficient to talk in sound bites. It's not sufficient to say, well, we want peace, and they don't, or whatever, because that's not really what it's about. It's not about peace. It's about who we are. It's about what we stand for. It's about what we teach our children. And it's about what the other side stands for and what they teach their children and what values are manifested in their behavior and in their actions. And these are kinds of things that take a while to explain.
Let's consider the security barrier itself. The Israel Supreme Court wrote a series of decisions saying the barrier is permissible, but that it has to take into account the needs of the Palestinian people, the needs of security, and the burden essentially is on the military to justify every kilometer of where the barrier exists. But at the same time, the International Court at The Hague ruled that the whole barrier was in violation of international law because you can't have a fence that's in territory that's occupied. Which is the correct rule of law?
So the first question we asked ourselves, can you make a fence at all? And our answer was yes and no. You can have a fence if it's a security fence. You can't have it if it's a political fence, if it's a border. This you can't do, because it's an occupied territory, because in order to do it, you have to take possession of land, which is not your land. The second question is, if it's not a political, do you have a military necessity for it? Because only if there is a military necessity, you can build a fence.
The fence is intended for one reason, is built after 10 years of terrorism. Israel faced 10 years of terrorism, 10 years of suicide bombings and roadside shootings, and more than 1,000 people killed, sometimes more than 100 people in a month killed. In a tiny country like Israel, that's a terrible toll. Multiply it by 50 to imagine the casualty numbers that would be in this country, because Israel is 1/50th the size of the United States.
It reminds me how insistent in the West to call our anti-terrorist barrier Berlin Wall. I was behind Berlin Wall. Right. Berlin Wall was meant to keep hundreds of millions of people from freedom, from the free world. This so-called wall is meant to keep terrorists, not to let terrorists to reach Jews and Arabs alike and to kill them.
We are standing next to the security fence. You can see the security fence on my left-hand side, and we can see the wall. We're talking about around 800 kilometers of fence, of security fence, from the north to the south. Just 4% of all of those 800 kilometers, it's a wall. This is the road number 6, the main highway of Israel that connects the south and the north, and it's less than 300 meters from here. Every simple sniper that have a very simple gun from the houses of Kalkilia can shoot very easily any kind of car that's driving along the road number 6, and those are civilians that are living in Tel Aviv, in Ramat Gan, in Beersheba, that are driving from place to place.
But how can we really approach Israel
Instead of just blaming the other party, how can we really approach Israel to give, instead of bombing certain places or having checkpoints or building the wall?
Israel should not compromise at all on checkpoints. Checkpoints have been extraordinarily effective. 10,000 terrorist acts have been prevented by checkpoints. And given a choice between waiting an hour and uncomfortableness and having people go into the middle of downtown Tel Aviv and blow up buses, I have to tell you, if I were a Palestinian or an Israeli or somebody from Mars, I would much prefer to see the delays and the checkpoints. Checkpoints will disappear instantaneously when terrorism disappears.
The area around Jerusalem was completely open. They can enter, and they do enter from almost every side into the city.
After Camp David, we paid with the life of 250 the first year, 450 Israelis at the second year, and then only when it accumulated into 1,000 Israelis exploded in discotheques, bus stations, restaurants, pizza shops, or even Passover, Seder ceremonies, that we were able to stop it by building the fence. So basically, the only solution in the long term is to have completed fence.
The Palestinians here, the terrorists here in the Gaza Strip, developed a different mechanism of terror of building these Qassam rockets and launching them onto Israel. That white fence you see is the internationally recognized border between Israel and the Gaza Strip. One of the reasons we have Qassams coming out of this area is because we can't have suicide bombers coming out of this area. It's very hard to cross over this fence, so it's not that Israel likes sending in soldiers or planes bombing areas into the Gaza Strip. It's that the only way to stop a Qassam is stopping it while it's still on the ground, or rather while it's still being fabricated.
If it was before the pullout from Gaza, I would have made one kind of argument. Now I won't bother. Now I'll say, well, Israel's not occupying Gaza. Gaza has swiftly become a place from which rockets are launched against Israeli civilians in Sderot without stop, and the Israeli government is not yet ready to go to war over it, so the civilians are having enormous psychiatric suffering.
Concrete structures that have been set up in every corner of this city, because when a Qassam is launched, it will arrive within 40 seconds and be detected within 20. So essentially, when you hear the siren, you have 10 to 15 seconds to find cover. And if you're playing soccer in the soccer field, there's nowhere to hide. And if you're walking to the shopping mall, there's nowhere to hide. And the Israeli government set up these concrete structures so that kids going to school or going to play soccer can hide under when they hear this terrible siren going off. And this is what kids have been living with for the past 7 years.
Just for everyone to understand, this is a Qassam rocket. At the end of the month, on the 27th, this rocket in fact landed around this area, landing in the city of Sderot, and this is just one of the 7,000.
You're being attacked for only one reason, because Hamas knew that they can take advantage of Israel's higher sense of morality. They fire their anti-personnel rockets, their murder weapons, from behind human shields. Their main goal is to deliberately kill as many Israeli citizens, civilians, men, women, children, as they possibly can, but their goal is also to try to provoke the Israel Defense Forces, because this is their cruel arithmetic of death.
Israel obtained footage of Qassam rockets being fired from a school, a grade school operated by the UN, by UNRWA, the agency to help Palestinian refugees.
This is a school, and a terrorist with a launcher here. He is doing something very, very cynical, using children, very young children, as human shields. He's arranging the launcher with the rocket, He is running to the school, and then he launched the rocket. Then we have to decide what we have to do. Are we going to hit the terrorist with 30 or 50 very young children or not? We decided not to hit the terrorists, but you can see how they behave. The moral issues that are really concerning me as the Air Force commander is really concerning all our people. There are two, let's say, two steps while fighting or while launching a missile, for example. The first one is to give the permission from the headquarters with the best intelligence that you have, with the understanding that this is the right time to do what we want to do. And the second step is after you launch a missile, it takes time to the missile to fly. And from the time that the commander of the operation in the headquarters is giving the approval to launch, we move to the step that the fighter that are launching the missile has the responsibility by himself.
הרבה אנשים מגיעים מתחתון לרחבה. הם לא מתקרבים לרכב אבל. אנשים על יד הרכב. הסט צלב לתוך השדה. הסט צלב לתוך השדה.
This responsibility is so deep that each and every soldier, pilot in the Air Force and in the IDF understand that this is part of his mission, his moral mission and operational mission.
Now, what do you do with a piece of information that you know that your population is undergo a missile attack originating from a school? Do you try to hit the school and tragically maybe have to deal with the consequence of killing innocent kids, or expose your own kids on the other side of the border because it's immoral to attack a school? Now, that's the type of dilemma Israel has to deal with every day. Israel said, we're cutting off the Gaza Strip. We cannot supply them with any more goods. If they want to lead their life, let them lead their life. We can no longer be intertwined with their economy. But then the world says, you're cutting off babies. This is a big prison. So what is the solution? I think every American should ask themselves, if there is a neighboring community that is hostile to mine, that is firing rockets on mine, that is trying to kill the people on my side of the border, should I be sending them food? Should I be sending them supplies? Or should I allow them to live their own life? Israel is judged in this case, I think, differently than many other countries would have been judged. And that's unfortunate, because if people were here and could see the reality, I think they would have a different perspective of what this issue is really about. This concept that was very popular in Israel of unilateral withdrawal as an attempt to show the Palestinians were headed towards peace, were willing to give back land even without negotiating, that used to be a popular notion in Israel. I think today there are much less people that are willing to support such a concept.
Israel engages in imperfect activities. They will sometimes try to kill a terrorist, and in the process, a civilian will die. So Israel gets condemned. And you point out that other countries in the world, many, many, many more civilians die in the process of attacking terrorists. And say, we're not talking about those other countries. We're talking only about Israel. Well, you can't talk only about Israel unless you're an Israeli. If you're an Israeli, you have a right to impose a higher standard on your own country, just like, as an American, I'm entitled to impose a higher standard on my country. But France has no right to impose a higher standard on Israel. England has no right to impose a higher standard on Israel. Academics all over the country have no right to do that. They must apply a single standard, and the United Nations has no right to apply a double standard to Israel. The United Nations has condemned Israel more than all the other countries of the world combined. If a space alien ever were to land in Turtle Bay and look at the United Nations, they would say, what a wonderful world we live in. There's such great peace. We have this great country called Syria, he's on the Security Council. Great country called Libya, they're chairman of the Human Rights Commission. Then there's this pariah state, this dark star called Israel that commits all the human rights violations in the world. There's something very wrong with the singular focus on Israel.
It's amazing that Israel is criticized on its human rights conduct. How did the United States behave after Pearl Harbor, when we were attacked by Japan? But we took Japanese Americans, some of them fourth-generation Japanese Americans, who were as American as apple pie, and we put them in concentration camps. We confiscated their property. All that time, from 1941, basically, to the 1980s, there was not even compensation to these people. That's how we reacted when we were threatened by Japan from thousands of miles away. Now consider tiny Israel, with a fairly large Arab population, with Arab countries right on its border, with a width of 8 or 9 miles at its narrowest point. How did Israel react after it was attacked by Arab countries and after it survived in 1948? Did it throw the Israeli Arabs into concentration camps? Did it confiscate all of their property? No. Israeli Arabs had the right to vote almost from day one. Israeli Arabs were electing members of the Knesset almost from day one.
I think one of the most depressing and disturbing aspects of this abuse of human rights to condemn Israel is that the Israeli military, in a very, very difficult situation, goes to major steps to avoid human rights abuses.
The civilian population should be treated humanely and with respect.
The IDF has a school for military law, which provides courses in the rules of warfare to commanders and to soldiers, in the form of lectures, in the form of lessons, also in the form of computer programs, which are special computer software, which is designed for that purpose.
In Jenin, 23 Israeli soldiers were killed on the ground in mines and booby traps and other things set by the Palestinians. That area, which was the hub of the terrorist attacks and the suicide bombings, could have been bombed from the air. But that would have meant a significant number of what's called collateral casualties, civilian casualties. Instead, the IDF went in on the ground, and that led to 23 soldiers being killed, a very large number in Israeli terms.
This Palestinian fighter, a senior member of Islamic Jihad who surrendered in Jenin. Their weapons, he said, were guns and locally made bombs and booby traps.
Anti-personnel bombs, maybe 1,000, 2,000 spread throughout the camp.
But they thought the Israelis would attack with planes and tanks, not foot soldiers.
It was like hunting, like being given a prize. I couldn't believe it when I saw the soldiers. The Israelis knew that any soldier who went into the camp like that was going to get killed.
Not only is Israel singled out for this for this labeling, for this tarring of it as a terrible human rights oppressor, as the worst human rights oppressor in the world, when you look at what goes on in Arab countries, in Syria, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, even worse in Sudan and Darfur, true genocides going on, the idea of singling out Israel is truly surreal.
To condemn Israel, to paint it in black as the world's greatest violator of human rights, really destroys the concept of human rights. It abuses it politically and ideologically for Israel bashing.
How is that in a world in which, human rights has emerged as the new secular religion of our time, something which we would all embrace, something which has been your life's work, that Israel is characterized as the meta-human rights violator of our time? Out of 12 condemnations in the first year of operation of the UN Human Rights Council, all 12 condemnations are against one member state of the international community, which happens to be Israel. But the worst thing about it is that the major human rights violators enjoy exculpatory immunity. No condemnations, not of Sudan, not of China, not of Syria, none whatsoever.
Let's look at the period of the Lebanon War, 2006. I don't think Human Rights Watch did anything for 2 months except condemn Israel. There were no reports on Sri Lanka, even though there were as many people killed in Sri Lankan bombings and attacks as in the Lebanon-Israel war. How do they pick their agendas? It can only be explained on the basis of emotion, political obsession, not on the basis of human rights.
If you compare other nations, democracies at war, including the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, Israel has a close supervision of the Supreme Court on everything. In Israel, you couldn't have a Guantanamo because the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court extends to everywhere where there are Israelis. And there's nothing outside the jurisdiction. There's nothing which is out of bounds for the Israeli Supreme Court.
I think Israel, who was under terror, not in September 11, but in September 10 and September 9 and September 13 and September 14, Israel, through all its organs, but I'm talking from the judicial point of view, is doing what it can, I think, in order to have the proper balance between security and rights. The proper balance not outside the law, but inside the law.
It is interesting that Israel always seems to be the one singled out. I gave a speech a year ago in London, and I asked a question. I said, I must have missed something. I must have missed the boycott resolutions they had on Syria, because after all, the Syrians are responsible for assassinating a Lebanese prime minister. I must have missed the boycott resolution of the Arab League, because after all, one of their members is responsible for a genocide in Darfur. I must have missed the boycott resolution of the Chinese, who have protected the Sudanese government as one tries to stop a genocide in Darfur. So I must have missed all those resolutions, didn't I? Well, if I didn't, I have to ask the question, what's different here? Why is Israel singled out?
The use of the United Nations to promote anti-Semitism and to promote hatred and the demonization of the State of Israel began right here, in this very room. Here we are in the General Assembly Hall where so much promise, so many expectations for combating the worst forms of hate and intolerance.
Back in 1947, when UN General Assembly Resolution 181 was adopted, the majority of the members of the new United Nations were either democracies or allies of democracies. To get into the UN back in 1945, you had to declare war either on Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan. And even if you were not a democracy, like the Soviet Union or Saudi Arabia, you still deferred to the values of the democracies. So when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came up for a vote, the Soviet Union and Saudi Arabia decided to abstain and not vote against, because the primary values of the early UN were the values of the democratic West. Fast forward to 2008, it's a different UN. You now have 194 countries. Most of these countries are not democracies, and most are driven to see the establishment of a world order which will support their interests, and their interests are preserving the rule of their leaders.
In early September 2001, there was a gathering in Durban, South Africa, the UN Conference on Racism and Xenophobia. The main part, the most damaging part of that conference, which most people now refer to as the infamous Durban Conference, was the NGO Forum. 1,500 non-governmental organizations, most of which had the term human rights somehow in their titles or in their charter: Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, International Commission of Jurists, superpowers, plus dozens of Palestinian groups and many from Europe gathered to declare Israel an apartheid state, to develop what's called a Durban strategy of 4 stages: isolation of Israel, sanctions, boycotts, to take Israel through the steps to become the new apartheid model, to totally delegitimize Israel. And this was at the same time that dozens of Israelis were being killed in bus bombings and other major attacks. This was the exact abuse of human rights, the exact inverse, the opposite of what human rights and morality should be all about.
These places and these gatherings are indeed platforms for nothing else but Israel bashing. And I really believe that anti-Israelism is the new anti-Semitism. Israel, at the end of the day, is the Jew among nations. And while it may not be bon ton and it may not be very popular and certainly not politically correct to be anti-Semitic, it's okay to be anti-Israel.
In 2007, the General Assembly adopted 20 resolutions condemning Israel, and only 5 or 6 condemning any other country remotely to do with human rights violations. Of all 192 countries, member states of the UN, the UN apparatus is set up in such a way to focus on the state of Israel. There is, in the UN, a division devoted to Palestinian rights, the only division devoted to a single people anywhere. There is a committee on the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. That committee was formed the same year that the UN adopted in 1975 the Zionism as Racism resolution.
The vote of each delegation will record in history its country's stand on anti-Semitic racism and anti-Judaism. This resolution, based on hatred, falsehood, and arrogance, is devoid of any moral or legal value.
United Republic of Tanzania. Si. Yes. United States.
No.
German Democratic Republic.
Yes.
72 voix pour, 35 voix contre, 32 abstentions. Le projet de résolution est adopté.
The United States rises to declare before the General Assembly of the United Nations and before the world that it does not acknowledge, it will not abide by, it will never acquiesce in this infamous act. A great evil has been loosed upon the world.
And it's still going strong. So in other words, although the resolution was rescinded, the body which was set up to implement the resolution still operates today.
Supporters of Israel feel that it is harshly judged by standards that are not applied to its enemies. And too often this is true, particularly in some UN bodies.
So when people savagely criticize only one country, and it's the only Jewish state, and when they do it in the name of being anti-racists, I look at them and I say, but what they're doing is racism.
There are rights of return. There is a right of return, perhaps, that Pakistanis have to India. Indians have to Pakistan, people from the Sudetenland. But in fact, in history, there have been many exchanges of population. Jews leave. Free speech. Free speech.
You don't even need to hear from us. The Israeli Law Journal article that you can hear and it's on the last few pages. Palestine will be free. Palestine will be free.
I understand why people who love oil don't support Israel. I understand why people who are Islamic zealots don't support Israel. I do not understand for the life of me why a person committed to human rights, feminism, environmentalism, gay rights would go against the one country in the Middle East that has all of those things and support countries that have none of those things. It just makes no sense. Criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. But just because you're critical of Israel doesn't mean you're not anti-Semitic. When you make criticisms that partake of Jewish stereotyping and talk about Jews controlling the media and Jews controlling politics and Jews being selfish, that begins to go over some lines.
I taught in my class the accusations of Henry Ford against the Jews in the 1920s. Henry Ford wrote a series of books. First they were articles and then published as books called The International Jew. And what is striking about those volumes is there is nothing which he doesn't blame on Jews. Contemporary music, which he hated, he blames on Jews. The problems of cities, he blames on Jews. Hollywood blames on Jews. Troubles on the American farm, he blames on Jews. Now, in each case, he was able to find, if you look far enough, he found one Jew here, one Jew there, to make it look persuasive. But of course, historians studying the material today understand that Henry Ford's International Jew tells us much more about Henry Ford than it tells us about Jews.
Right here at Harvard, right in this campus, right behind us, there is a professor by the name of Professor Stephen Walt. He and a colleague from the University of Chicago, John Mearsheimer, both regarded as very prominent political scientists, wrote a very controversial book, Israel Lobby and United States Foreign Policy, in which they claim that there is simply no case for Israel and the United States to have any kind of special relationship. They say there is no moral case, there is no legal case, there is no political case, there is no case in terms of U.S. interest. They say that it is against U.S. interests to have this close relationship between Israel and the United States. And they ask themselves, why, therefore, does this relationship exist? And they say it is because of Israel that the United States has a terrorism problem, and it is because of Israel that the United States was attacked on 9/11. Now, none of these things are true. Are they terrible scholars? Are they incompetent? Or do they simply choose to believe anything that is anti-Israel? Which is why people like David Duke, the neo-Nazi and former KKK leader, applauded their papers. He said, "This is great, this is what I've been saying all along." They ought to worry if somebody like David Duke says that their paper was great.
You know, Walt and Mearsheimer have it exactly backwards. There is a lobby that has had too much influence on American foreign policy, that doesn't reflect the attitudes of Americans, and that buys its influence through money. It's called the Saudi lobby. No American supports Saudi Arabia, and yet Saudi Arabia has enormous influence in Washington. The reason Israel has substantial influence in Washington is the vast majority of Americans support Israel. It's a free vote for most congressmen and senators because their constituents back home support Israel. That's democracy in action.
Let's take a look at where Israel is in the Middle East. Let's look at what they face in the Middle East. They face Hezbollah in the north, they face Syria, they face Iran, they face a radical Islamist threat that is unrelenting in terms of the nature of that threat. So to the extent to which, in fact, they face daunting military challenges, or at least what could be ongoing threats and potentially existential threats, especially with someone like Iran, it's not a surprise that we would have a significant stake in providing Israeli security assistance, in no small part because Israel has always said, we'll fight our own battles. We don't want you to fight our battles.
I don't think it's understood enough in the West that the anger, the rage of radical Islam on Israel is because radical Islam thinks of Israel as a reflection of, as an extension of Washington, D.C. in the Middle East. That's what they say. You can find it on all of the Arab websites and the Muslim websites, that they look at Israel as an extension of Washington. They're not angry at Washington because of Israel. They're angry at Israel because they look at us as an extension of the freedom and democracy that is what America is all about.
It has been a premise of American policy for a long time that if you're going to be able to make peace in the Middle East, and we have been in the forefront always of trying to promote Arab-Israeli peace, Israel's not going to be able to make peace if it feels highly insecure. So one of the purposes is to give Israel a sense of confidence, a sense of its security, both in terms of the nature of the American commitment, but also in terms of providing them the wherewithal so they can feel confident that they can handle security on their own.
In Congress, when it comes to Israel, we always speak with one voice.
Any time that Israel is perceived as weak in the Arab world, any time that Israel is perceived as losing, as being what Osama bin Laden refers to as the weak horse, then the same people who are attacking American forces in Iraq and in Afghanistan and seek to attack the United States mainland believe that they are on the march. It's easier for them to mobilize supporters, to mobilize recruits, because they say, wait, if the mirror image of the United States in the Middle East, as we see it, as jihadists see it, Israel, is losing, then that means that America is losing. And if Israel can be destroyed, then obviously America is next on our list.
Iran sits on, obviously, one of the major pools of oil in the world, and yet they have to import gasoline because they're short of refinery capacity. It's a tremendous strategic liability that they're short of refinery capacity, and yet they're not putting their money into refineries. They're putting the money into nuclear power and long-range ballistic missiles. The question is why? I think pretty clear the only answer is they want nuclear weapons. And not just nuclear weapons, but the ability to deliver those nuclear weapons through long-range missiles, and not just hitting Israel. They're already well past the point of being able to hit Israel with their missiles. They can now hit Western Europe, and they are approaching the ability to hit parts of the United States with these missiles.
Rafsanjani said a few years ago, if we get a nuclear weapon and drop it on Israel, we will kill 3 to 5 million Jews. They will drop it on Tehran, kill 10 to 15 million Muslims, and the trade-off will be worth it. When you hear a leader of a country say that, and you know that the country is seeking to develop nuclear weapons, you don't wait until the bomb drops.
Iran is a threat to its own neighbors. I mean, it undermines regimes in the region, it works with radical elements in different places, it represents an ideology. Our borders are not relevant. The crucial day is a day in which Iran's neighbors, which are part of the Arab world and Muslim world, understand that the world is not determined enough to stop Iran, because we live in a neighborhood in which whether you beat the bully or join it. And while we are talking in terms of two different camps of moderates and extremists, this can change in a day, in a moment in which those which are part of the pragmatic camp understand that the world is not going to stop Iran. We cannot afford this.
Iran is the most vivid, real, imminent threat to world peace and security, not just to Israel. And some people tell me, you know, this Ahmadinejad, he's crazy. Don't pay any attention to him, you know. Now, we paid a very high price for thinking leaders were crazy and for disregarding what they're saying. And had we listened more carefully in the 30s, maybe we could have avoided the Holocaust or even World War II. But, you know, when Chamberlain said, I have a piece of paper here, he believed he struck a deal with Hitler. And people who are trying today to appease Ahmadinejad or to discount him and say, look, he doesn't really mean it. To all those people, I have only one answer. Don't believe us. Don't listen even to the Americans. Listen to him and take him at face value. This man means it. This man is preparing it. This man denies the Holocaust while very diligently preparing the next one. The world cannot and shall not, and I hope will not, live with a nuclear Iran or accept a nuclear Iran.
Radical Islam today, whether it's of the Sunni variety coming out of Saudi Arabia or the Shiite variety coming out of Iran, sees democracy as the enemy. Their goal is to establish a theocratic state run by mullahs in the case of Iran, run by the shared power of the Saudi royal family and the Wahhabi clerics in the case of Saudi Arabia. But the idea that the decisions that affect your life are made by the people is something which is anathema to the two main strands of radical Islam.
I think it is the case that if Iran had the nuclear capability, those who would say, gee, deterrence worked in the Cold War, it'll work here, they are misreading the nature of this Iranian regime, especially at least one segment of it that is quite missionary and ideological and almost mystical in terms of its view of the coming of the 12th Imam. And where the consequences are so severe, you have to be quite concerned about it. Do I think that they would go ahead, even if they had the capability, and drop a bomb on the Israelis? Not necessarily, but do I think that they might find a way to transfer and deny that they transfer the capability? That worries me much more.
When you say transfer capability, you mean to Hezbollah or some other surrogate group that might be able to have nuclear-tipped rockets or be able to smuggle dirty bombs into Israel or other countries, including the United States?
Absolutely, because look, Iran denied they provided anything to Hezbollah militarily, when we know that they provided almost over 90% of their military material in terms of all the rockets. So you could say nuclear weapons are different. One of the things we have to do as a result is we have to have real accountability, to create the real pressure on them so that they would understand that there would be a catastrophic consequence for them of any kind of transfer.
When you have a crazy ideology that is bent on world conquest, and it begins with anti-Semitic rantings and then with anti-Semitic pogroms, that fire will soon spread to other peoples, to other countries, and ultimately to the entire world. The Western governments know that Ahmadinejad and Iran are racing to acquire nuclear weapons. They know that they're not only out to get us, but out to radicalize the entire world and to dominate the entire Middle East and well beyond that. They say we can hoodwink anyone, we'll get this bomb and then we can use it. We can use it and we can use it again, or we can use it as an extortion for our mad fantasies of reestablishing some Islamic caliphate that goes from Iran to Spain. The main point that wasn't understood in the 30s, and perhaps is not understood today, that it never ends with the Jews.
When I speak on college campuses, most of the students who are on the pro-Israel side are also pro-Palestine. But most of the students who are on the pro-Palestine side are virulently anti-Israel. And that's a key difference.
Israeli society has broadly accepted the concept of territorial compromise and a two-state solution. 20 years ago, Israelis said, don't talk to me about a Palestinian state. Now, the vast majority of Israelis accept that. Palestinian society hasn't even started that debate yet. Palestinians have to have that debate among themselves. And then we can start seeing compromises.
Not only are the majority of terrorists Muslim, but the vast majority of victims are Muslim. Each and every day, hundreds of Muslims are killed in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Algeria, in Morocco, in Sharm el-Sheikh, in Amman. And to me, the most frightening thing is the eerie silence of the Muslim world and of the United Nations, where you don't see a single person stand up and say, enough is enough. You know, it's as if we live in a world where when Christians kill Muslims, it's a crusade. When Jews kill Muslims, it's a massacre. When Muslims kill Muslims, it's the Weather Channel.
Our power, our strength is in fact that Israel is the only real, deep, vibrant democracy in this part of the world. And peace will prevail here when we will have as allies among Palestinians, among Syrians, among Lebanese, people who also believe in democracy and freedom.
There is a struggle today for the soul and identity of the Palestinians. Will they be a secular national movement, which they have always been, or will they become an Islamist movement? Hamas has taken over Gaza. It is imperative that those who represent a secular national future for the Palestinians and who believe in coexistence will be the ones who will shape the Palestinian future and identity over time. If they do, I remain hopeful about the future. If they don't, then it's a much more, unfortunately, a much less promising, hopeful future.
When asked many years ago, when do I think peace will come to this region, to our country, and our neighboring countries, I said, the date, I do not know. But I know under what conditions it will come. When there will be a leader, a great leader of an Arab country. He will come and say, or he will wake up one morning and feel sorry for his own people, for his own sons that have fallen in battle. That day will be the beginning of peace between us and them.
Let us hope that the peace process that we have started together, Mrs. Meir and me, will continue and flourish on the basis that I have already mentioned to you, which will give satisfaction to every girl, every woman, every man in Israel, in the Arab world.
The leadership of the Palestinian people unequivocally stated that they want no Jewish state more than they want a Palestinian state. And as I've said over and over and over again, the day the Palestinian people and their leaders want their own state more than they want to see the destruction of the Jewish state, there will finally be a two-state solution.